First person I ever saw die was Miss Minnie Bale. And my grandmother, we lived in the corner house, and Miss Minnie lived here, and her husband. And Miss Minnie got sick, and they ran down and got my grandmother. And I was probably 6 or 7 years old, and came back with her, and we sat on the side of the bed, and I watched Miss Minnie die. So she was the first person I ever saw die. My grandmother loved cars, and she would trade often, and her favorite cars were Packards. She drove Packards all the time. Fortunately for us kids, she would let us borrow the cars. We're going to turn right here. My pet cemetery is right out there. You know, you buried all your pets, so Shep is buried out there, and Tippett's buried out there in that field. A couple of cats, and my grandmother raised canaries, and so there's a canary graveyard out there too. We would swim in the dam, and the dam, they really raised it even higher to get more pressure for the meal, and we all watched all that taking place. They pretty much kept these banks cleaned off of the creek. Clover Creek, if you went all the way up past where we're going, there was a Baptist church there that's one of the oldest in Madison County. We're really on a plantation. This was the Jackson Plantation, and that's who Bemis and Madison County bought the first land from. It was 300 acres of land in the first plot, and then Bemis added another 300 acres to it. Miss Lucy, in my day, and you know this was not called Butler Street, it was called Congo. And so we're on what was Congo Street. We're fixing to pass the barn, and this is on the National Register of Historic Places, and it really needs to be a major project of ours. It's very unusual. The Bemises were from Boston, Massachusetts, primarily, and so a lot of the construction you see, and I think in this last study we discovered that probably the person who did more for building here was not Judson Moss, but he was his son Albert Falwell Bemis, who had just graduated from MIT, and he and two of his friends really basically were commissioned, I guess is as good a word, to build the town of Bemis. That is the barn, and it's nearly overcovered now, but there's money available to save it, literally, because it is a barn of American history, actually. It was built beautifully. Inside the stalls for the horses, they cut 4x4s and turned them up on them, and then they covered that in tar, so the horses were standing on something that was fairly soft for them. They weren't standing on a concrete floor. And of course, as kids, we played in the hayloft. Mr. Young his garden was right here, and my grandfather oversaw the garden for the Youngs all the time. He and Mr. Fred Young were very close friends, and the horses, of course, were kept right there, and like I said, the first tractors. This is a really historic site that we're looking at. Rosenwald owned Sears and Roebuck, and in the 1900s he built 5,000 schools. We're going to go straight on go. And this is one of them. This is a Rosenwald school built by Sears and Roebuck in 1917. And it is on the National Register. And that's Miss Lucy's project. So she's really into that. And we've got the National Trust now helping us and all to restore that school, actually. It's one of the last in the area. And technically none of us were aware that that's what it was. The little grocery store for Congo was the first little house. Miss Lucy lives in the next house. And I want to stop here. I had many grandmamas in my life, and I had two mammies in my life that helped raise me. And one of them was Miss Minnie Butler, and I realize now that Miss Minnie, probably when she started taking care of me, was a teenager. And she married Willie Butler, who became a kind of a straw boss with my grandfather all the time. And Miss Minnie lives right here, and Miss Minnie is 90, Miss Lucy? 88? 98 years old, and still living. And of course the street's named after the Butlers, actually. But they lived here, and I've told Miss Lucy this story Miss Minnie, my wife became a nurse and was administrative supervisor of the Jackson Hospital, and she got Minnie a job at the hospital, and Minnie went on with education and all this kind of stuff. But in the beginning, I would take Minnie into town and just stuff like that. And one day she kept calling me to come get her. And I was real busy. I was managing Bankers Life and Casualty, and I kept saying, I can't come right now. I can't come right now. And she'd call again, and I would come. By the time I got where I could come, I came in my pickup truck, and she was at my house. And so I picked her up, and I had an agent from New York in training, and he was with me and really driving the truck. So when she got in, and she was not a real large lady, and of course I was mad at her, and she got in and sat down, and I said, I want to tell you something. You can't do that anymore, that I'm busy, and I can't just stop what I'm doing and come get you. So if you do that again, you can't come to my house. I can't do that. And she looked at me real sort of, tapped me on the shoulder real hard, and she said, let me tell you something, white boy. She said, I was in the house when you were born. I'll come to your house when I get ready, and there ain't a damn thing you can do about it. I thought the agent would wreck the truck. He couldn't wait to get back to the office and tell my agent, said, you ought to heard Mr. Billy's mammy. She straightened him out this morning. Her mind is bad, of course, now, and the only way I can communicate with her, she gets me mixed up with my Uncle Billy, and they were about the same age. And I was over here with Miss Lucy and them one afternoon, and Miss Minnie was sitting on the porch with some other ladies, and I walked over here where she was, and I told them, I said, now, she won't know who I am unless I do a couple of things, and when I do, she will know. And so I was holding her hand, and I said, you remember when you and I set the house on fire? And she said, Billy Joe, and got this laughing, and she told him, she said, we did, that I was babysitting him, and it was Halloween, and we decided we'd make us a lantern, and we did, and cut it all out and put us a candle in it and set it in the window, and it set the drapery on fire. And I can still remember her yanking all that drapery down trying to get that fire put out exactly. I want to tell you another story. I'm going to try to get through it. Let's do that, because Miss Lucy knows this one. Willie and my grandfather just became extremely close friends. If you saw one of them, you pretty much saw the other one. And Willie would help on the farm all the time, and they had a wonderful time together, really, to be honest with you. And Willie would tell me all the time, Mr. Spence, that was my grandfather's name, and Mr. Spence carried a rubber snake with him all the time in his pocket. And when they'd be working in the fields, and especially baling the hay, he would hide that snake in a hay bale. And of course they would get ready to pick it up and throw it on the truck, and here this rubber snake would fall out, and they would all abandon the hay picking up. And occasionally Willie told me one day, said, Mr. Spence sneaked up behind me and dropped that rubber snake in my overalls. And he said, I just took all my clothes off right out in the hayfield. So they lived a happy life together, very much so, and they were together pretty much every day. My grandfather had a stroke and was down, of course, later on in his life, and Willie had a stroke. And so we would come back and forth occasionally. One day when I came in from Louisiana, I asked my grandfather, I said, is there anything you want to do while I'm here? And he said, I want to go to Bemis to see Willie. And I said, okay. And the other was Mama Fry stated he wanted to come in and see Mama Fry, who was one of the oldest ladies in town. So I brought him in, and we pulled the car up here and went in, and Minnie and I put Willie in a wheelchair and brought him out and put him in the car with my grandfather. And they just had the best time. They laughed and talked and told all the stories they could think of and all. And I should have picked up on this, but I didn't. When we got ready to go, my grandfather said to Willie, I won't see you again, Willie. Well, he didn't. And then he wanted to go see Mama Fry, and we did. And it was the same thing, exactly. But I didn't realize it. I didn't really realize that he was telling me, in essence, that he was ready to die. So he died a short time after that. Well, I called Minnie to tell her that my grandfather had died, and Minnie said, Bill, I can't tell Willie. He said every morning he says, call and see how Mr. Spence is. And she said, and she did. And she said, I just think it would kill him if he knew that. And so we're just going to let it ride. And I said, that's fine with me. In about an hour, she called me back, and she said, I can't do that, Bill. I can't lie to him every morning. And she said, so I'm fixing to tell him that Mrs. Spence has passed away. So I said, do you want me to come out there? And she said, no, I can do that, but we want to come to the funeral home. And so she called me back and said, we're getting ready to come into the funeral home. Will you meet us? And so I said, I will meet you at the door. I'll be there. And so she brought him, and we put him in his wheelchair. And there was such a crowd at the funeral home, they had moved my grandfather from the viewing room into the chapel, actually, and put him in there. And we brought Willie in and rolled him down to the coffin. And he didn't say anything. Well, of course, Miss Lucy knows blacks don't go to white funeral homes very often. And so there wasn't anybody. It was full of people. But it got real quiet when they saw Willie sitting there by the coffin. And he sat there for a while. And finally he reached over in the coffin and got my grandfather's hand. And he said, I will see you in heaven, Mrs. Spence. I think that's one of the things that makes Bemis so important to all of us, is that we lived through all of that in a community that was completely different from most communities.
Let's go on. We're going to go to the end. There's a church that we can pull off of the parking lot. There's a church on the home there. We can pull in the parking lot.
We're going to go up here. The little church that Miss Lucy belongs to started in the school, and they have built a beautiful building up here at the end of this street now. A lot of these families are in 2 and 3 generations of owning these houses also, but this was called Congo is what it was. Every year the high school had a little weenie roast for the freshmen that were coming in. It was just tradition, and they had it up at the Bemis cemetery all the time is where they would have it. And Mr. Walker, our new principal, called all of our senior class in and said to us, if you bother that hot dog deal, I will get you. And I mean that sincerely, because what we did every year, the senior class would break up the parties, what would go on. And so, you know, we had to do tradition. That was just a part of it. So we waited till dark, and we came over and we broke up the party. Well, we left. We escaped through the woods, and I'm going to show you where it was. We got through the woods, and we all left. The next morning, we got to school, and Mr. Walker would call one of us at a time. He started at 8 o'clock, and he would, like, over the PA system, he would say, Billy King, come to the office. Well, we would go, and he would whip us. You know, that was just what he did. And so we were all getting ready. This went on all day long. About every few minutes, he would call one of us to come to the office. And you could hear it. He left the PA system on, and you could hear the whipping. You know? But anyhow, we couldn't figure out how in the world he knew who was there. And so when we had our 50th class reunion, Mr. Walker came, and he said, Bill, how about if I tell you how I knew how to whip all of you? And I said, okay, sir. So he said, I don't know why you didn't figure this out. He said, you were plowing the field, which would be that field right over there, that day, and what we broke up the party with was clods of dirt. We got off in those woods and would throw those clods of dirt at the freshmen, and of course run them away from the weenie roast fires. And he said, what I did, I just went to the pool hall when everybody left and walked around in the pool hall. That you had plowed that field and all of your shoes had fresh plowed dirt on them. And so I could easily figure out exactly who was there. And he said, that's how I knew to whip the ones that I really did. But it was 50 years before we actually knew that. And he said the other thing you would do, all of you would gather in the boys' bathroom and discuss it. And of course I could hear it through the PA system, so I knew exactly what had happened. But we were 50 years in knowing that. This little road goes around, and it really goes to the Clover, to the church now. Well, I still can't get the name of the Cane Creek. And it was organized by one of the first Baptist ministers that came into West Tennessee. There's a cemetery at the top of the hill that was maintained by the company, and it is the Bemis Cemetery, actually.